All right, everyone's filing in. Thank you everyone for joining us. Good afternoon. It's the last session of the first day of our teachers programme, so thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'd like to just start off by saying a big thank you to our kind sponsors, Trinity College London and Macmillan Education. And it's Macmillan Education that has sponsored this session for us this afternoon. Because of their support, we can put on this conference for you for free, which we're really happy to do. The second year in a row, we've been able to deliver this for you for free. We just want this content to be available and accessible to as many of you as possible. So once again, thank you to our sponsors, and thanks to all of you at home or in your offices for joining us. So this afternoon, I'm joined by Zarina Subhan, who's a very experienced teacher trainer, and a materials writer. And she will be talking to you about how to incorporate inclusive materials into your classroom. We encourage you to take part. Please do pop your questions or your comments in chat, or if you want to even raise your virtual hand, we're happy to hear your voices as well. We will take questions at the end, so please do get involved. These sessions are for you. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Zarina. Thank you so much, Zarina.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. And thank you also to English UK for the invitation and the request for the topic around race, diversity, equity and inclusion. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and start my slideshow. Okay, so just bear with me until I get that slideshow popping up. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides. Yep, great. Siobhan's nodding away. So I called my talk today "The Spice of Life," and English UK, I found out since being asked to do this talk, have a very strong ethos to actually be anti-racist. That term might be a very strange term, but there's been a lot of discussion around, if you're not racist, does that mean it's enough? And actually the action of being anti-racist is much more active and allows the topic to be brought up, allows people to question things if they don't agree with it, or if they can see a problem with it. And it's along that line that I called my talk "The Spice of Life," because I think if we don't have a variety of views, opinions in the melting pot, then it's going to be one person's opinion against another. And I think it's really important to include everyone. And so my aim today is to talk about representation, to talk about diversity, equity and inclusion in ELT, and actions that we can take as ELT teachers. Okay, so representation then, in terms of representation, I'd like to ask you to use the chat box and tell me, if I said the word black, what images would come to your mind? Okay, so using the chat box, please, if you would, just type a word or two to say what comes to mind when I say the word black. Right, absolutely anything, but the first thing that comes to your mind, just type it in. Okay. Night. Thank you, Roz. Roz has started us off. Oh, New Guyen has said exactly the same. Cat, colour, dress, BLM, Black Lives Matter, cat. It's funny how we have this thing about black cats, isn't it? Yeah. I love them. I don't know about you. Well, I did that and I typed in the word, Alex, thank you, has said night. I typed in the word black. Oh, look, we've got blackboard. That shows your age, because I can tell what kind of educational environment you came from. Colour, Juaria says, Slavenka says BLM for Black Lives Matter again. Well, I went to Pixabay. I don't know if you know Pixabay.com. It's a a website that provides free images to use. They also have images that you can pay for, but they have a nice range of images that are free as well. And I typed in the word black just to see what images came up on their free site. And these were the images that I got, interestingly enough. Okay. Let me kind of, yeah, it's the black night that some of you mentioned. It's space because it's dark matter. A range of images, but related to light. Yeah. Okay. And then I did the same thing with the word white. So how about you type in the chat box again and tell me what image comes to mind when I say white. Snow, Ross says. Lily, Emily said. Empty room, chocolate, light, sheet, innocence, Neil said. Cold, Tayeba says. Thank you for that. Yeah. And interestingly enough, when I did the same thing in terms of Pixabay, these were the images that came to mind. So some of the things that you said, someone mentioned lily. Well, there's a daisy, there's light. I think there's snow somewhere there as well. Yes, we've got the trees in the snow. We've got the white horse. We've got the puppy, interestingly enough. Clouds, fluffy clouds. So that got me thinking. And I thought, well, what is this implying? And in a way, what we're seeing are things such as innocence, which I think it was Neil who mentioned that. You've got the puppy, the white fox, the white horse. What does that represent to you? The image of a white horse. Using the chat box again. What brings to my dream? Freedom. Something unusual. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Adventure, Joari says. Yeah. Interesting, right? So we can also think about words that we use that are related to black and white phrases, for example. So some of you mentioned snow. Well, we've got Snow White. We've got white lie. We've got white night. We've got whiter than white. Snow White is related to innocence. White lie is forgivable. It's not that big a deal. White knight, I discovered recently, is a term, actually. It's a business term used in the business world when a company is put on the stock market and instead of having to take the highest bidder just to save the company, a white knight comes in, buys the company, but allows them to maintain their ethos and way of working. And they basically stop a buyer who perhaps is not actually wanted, but is offering the best price. And so that's a term. Whiter than white is someone who's scrupulous, who's just can't do anything wrong, and you will have trouble finding fault with them. Yeah. So you've got all of those ideas of innocence, forgivable, protector of rights, and being squeaky clean. Yeah. Whereas common phrases to do with black, you've got blacklist. If you're blacklisted, you're maybe not going to be allowed into a group for whatever reason. Black magic. You've got blackmail. You've got black market. These are all normal words that are used in everyday English language. Blacklist is banishment. You've done something wrong, you will never be forgiven, or at least for a certain amount of time. black magic has the impression of evilness. You've got extortion through blackmail, and black market is something illicit. So you've got all of these ideas of rejection and impurity on one hand, and on the other hand, you've got this idea of innocence and purity. So the way we represent things that we show, the language we use, can all play a part in the ideas that we represent as well. Now, no one does it on purpose. We're not using the word blacklist in a negative way or in a terrible way. It's just part of the language. But we need to actually consider, why is it part of the language? Why is it being accepted as part of the language as well? And so the language we use is really important, especially in the English language teaching classroom. And I put into a cloud map, I think it's called, an article that someone wrote on the topic of what should you call people and what should we be called. And it's been written by a person who lives in the United States and is of Vietnamese and American upbringing. So born in Vietnam, lived there until the age of 8, I think it was, and then moved to the US. And she was basically reflecting on the various names we have to call different groups of people. And I put that article into word cloud and got that image, which I think is rather nice, because people comes out first. And then you've got all the terms that we might use: non-white, white, color, American, majority, black, Chinese, Latinx. Yeah, so it's an interesting article, and it talks about the different terms that we use to describe people. So often we may use the word Caucasian, which generally is used to mean a non-black person would be Caucasian. So someone possibly of European extraction. White is another term that you might use, and Aryan is another term that's been used historically since the tribe of Aryans who existed in Northern Europe. And then you've got terms like coloured, black, Asian. And people react differently depending on their origins, their heritage, their sensitivities, their political stance. And coloured to someone in South Africa, for example, would imply that that person is of heritage that has been blended somewhere in their history between black and a white person, or a non-white person and a white person. Coloured, when I was growing up, was something a little bit uncomfortable. It was, you said it because you didn't really know what to call someone. And if someone called me coloured, I kind of, as a child, I remember thinking, I'm not black or green or blue. Why are they calling me coloured? And this article talks about these terms as well. Person of colour has been used much more in recent years and is used a lot more in the United States than I think it is in the UK. You've got woman of colour because you've got different issues coming into place as a female in society and a non-white female in society. So it's accumulated, if you like, the kind of reaction that you might have towards you in society. And also you've got BAME, or BAME, which has been used more recently in the UK. It's not so common in the United States. And interestingly, is coloured something negative? Is black something negative? Is calling someone Asian something negative? Is it more polite to be calling someone a person of color or BAME? Well, interestingly, I think it often is what is acceptable in society and isn't. And that usually comes from what those people want to be called. Now, Caucasian and Aryan, I would say, are lesser used, and white is much more common. But for a person who is not white, you've got this whole array of descriptions, and people don't know, am I being politically correct by saying black or Asian, or should I not be saying that? And I think it's worth having conversations with people who are not white if you don't know what to call someone. So, for example, I am of Indian heritage. Could I be black? I could be, I think, because often black is used as a term as not being white. But why do we have all these terms when actually the majority of the world is not white? And that's an interesting question, I think. It reflects the power that comes with being white. And that brings us on to the idea of privilege. By having just one term to describe a whole group of people, whether they're European descent or Australian or white South African, doesn't matter. And yet, when you're describing a person who's non-white, you have much more distinct terms. And the article I was referring to suggests calling people global majority people, because in actual fact, non-white people around the world are in a majority. And there was a commission on race and ethnic disparities that reviewed the causes of race inequality in the UK. And they published their report in 2021. And they said aggregate terms like BAME, B-A-M-E, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic, were no longer helpful and should be dropped, advocating instead a focus on understanding disparities and outcomes for specific ethnic groups. Now, the government, the UK government, for which this report was commissioned, responded by producing its own report on the Commission report, which was published 17th of March this year, called Inclusive Britain. And said that BAME excludes certain ethnic minority groups, for example, mixed, gypsy, Roma, traveller, and other white ethnic minority groups. And part of the problem is that BAME is also often used as a proxy for non-white, which isn't why it was created, because that term should also actually include white ethnic minority groups, such as Gypsy, Roma, or Irish communities, who often in the UK faced a lot of discrimination. As I was growing up in the 70s, people used to talk about the paddy wagon, which was actually a police van, because it was so common for arrests to be made of Irish immigrants that it became known as the paddy wagon. And they have, as a group, experienced a great deal of racism and differentiation and discrimination in the UK. So they are a white ethnic minority group that has faced historically a lot of discrimination. So perhaps we should consider talking about global majority people and white people. Maybe that is a better way of talking about people. But whatever we do and whatever we decide on, I think it should be an interesting conversation that we could have with our students in an ELT classroom, because we're talking about language after all. So it's a perfectly rich environment to be discussing these things, I think. So moving on, if it would let me, to diversity, equity and inclusion in ELT. Now, diversity, equity and inclusion also involves diverse ways of learning in the classroom, providing equity for people who learn in different ways, who may have a disability, who may have a learning difficulty, who may have been economically disadvantaged. So, for example, through the pandemic, some of your students may have lost internet connectivity, and that affected their education. That could have been because of economic issues, because of the kind of house that they lived in, the location. It may have had very poor network. They may be very far from the grid. So those kind of things are also included in equity. And inclusion is the idea that nobody is ignored in education, that everyone's issues are dealt with in some form as best we can. And that can include race and discrimination as well, because that can also include and lead to economic disparities. For the sake of the talk today, I'm going to stick with the idea of inclusion, including diverse cultures, diverse backgrounds, and diverse groups, and not excluding anyone. And I've used here chilies as an example of the spice, because variety is the spice of life. But just like chilies, if you just use just one spice and you use too much of it, it can overpower and color everything else. And that's, you can say, is what happens when you're a minority in a country that is maybe your country, because you were born there, you grew up there, you're part of the culture, you understand that, but you are treated differently nevertheless. Or you're a visiting student to the UK, as probably many of your students are, and they are outside of their familiar culture and society, and they feel very different and vulnerable as a consequence of being there. So we need to make sure that our perspective in our classrooms are not only from one perspective or looking at one culture either. So perhaps this is the kind of thing that we should be aiming for. Using the chat box, is this something like what your classroom might look like, I wonder? Using the chat box, just give a yes or a no. Does your classroom, whether it's online or face-to-face, look something like this in terms of a mix of people? Using the chat box, just give me a quick yes or a no. Not really, we've got no. Evie says, Deepa says yes, Simon says from time to time, Slavenka says yes. So that's just giving me an idea of what it's like. Ah, Neil, interesting, not since the pandemic. Joaria says no, Rebecca says no. So it seems that pre-pandemic, it was perhaps more like this. During the pandemic, it appears that it might not be. And from time to time, it can still be. Yeah. And if you do have a class that looks like this, then I think we should also be very conscious of making sure everybody in that class is included too. If you're using images to represent people, we need to think about the images that we use. They should look like the people in your classroom. Yeah. Yes, we're dealing with English as a foreign language. We're dealing with English. But does everything have to be from an English perspective? We can still use language to discover other things about other people, other people's backgrounds and cultures, and still be using English. It doesn't have to be all about, for example, the Beatles, the Queen, and Britpop. You know, we can still move outside of those topics. Thank you, Neil, for your explanation there. That nationality mixes are much reduced since the pandemic, and still a problem. Okay, interesting that it could be a problem. Yes, a problem in the sense that it isn't such a rich mix. But in a sense, if you have got one particular nationality group in your classes, it does mean that we can get them to talk about their culture more, or their traditions, or their way of life. They're still using English language, but they're using it as a tool to describe how they live, how they do things, how they practice day-to-day things. And that's surely a positive, because you've got a group of people who share the same background and culture, therefore they know what the other people are talking about, and therefore they can comment and say, well, no, I wouldn't say that, I would say this, and I would disagree with that. And so you could actually have quite a rich discussion there about cultural ideas, or ideas of citizenship, or ideas of how to live or behave. And that can be a rich discussion. Equally so if it was a mixed group, except they may not see things from each other's perspective. So as a teacher, our job would be in a mixed group to actually facilitate tolerance while we're listening and considering other people's views and ways of doing things. Whereas if it's a single nationality group, or just a couple of nationalities that maybe share similar values, then our job is much more from a linguistic perspective of getting them to comment and give opinions and agree or disagree with each other. So it's still very much an ELT kind of activity taking place, except we can be more inclusive. And if we think about it, the majority of the world now are non-native speakers of English. So it's not such a bad thing if our students are able to describe to the outside world, or to people from a different culture, or at least practice being able to describe how they live, how they think, what their attitudes are based on, what they like to eat or drink and why, and historical perspectives on culture as well. So because the chances are your students are going to be using English as a lingua franca to speak to other non-native speakers of English, right? So they're going to be talking across cultures, whoever they're communicating with. It's only when they are dealing with native speakers that they actually have to maybe think about the culture of an English-speaking environment country, for example. Yeah. Yet in ELT, often our business is teaching about culture of Britain or the US or Australia, Canada. And we don't delve into other English-speaking countries such as India, for example, or Pakistan, South Africa that uses English, Sri Lanka. English is a tool of cultural understanding, because you've got two different ethnic groups that speak different languages, but they both speak English. Similar with India, if you travel from one end of the country to the other, you're likely not going to be able to speak the state language, and so people communicate through English. So it's possible to be doing different things while still using ELT in the classroom, which brings to our mind and makes us conscious of the fact that we're not just one culture just because we're using English. Yeah. And that helps our students feel included as well. Now, the images that we do use, it's important to avoid the idea of exotic images. So we're not feeding the idea of stereotypes that may already exist in the world. So we need to be aware of that. And when we do use images, including images of differently abled people doing normal things in a positive light, not necessarily suffering because of their disability, and giving these images and ideas and putting them across without saying, oh, look, here's a person who's differently able to us. It's just sort of one image out of many, and therefore no one even bats an eyelid. So it becomes the norm. Yeah. So actions that we can take then, practical things that we can do in the classroom. I had a group of teachers from China who were doing a 1-month course for teacher training in the UK. And they really came to life when they had the opportunity to represent China. And they were aware of how proud they felt about their culture and how they wanted to explain things about China that may be misunderstood. And it happened to coincide with China Day. They were away from home. They weren't able to celebrate China Day. So we celebrated it in the form of presentations, of invitations to all the teaching staff, and they put on little drinks and food and gave us a little demonstration of calligraphy and typical Chinese customs. And they really, really enjoyed doing that. They were using English. They were using their presentation skills, which they were practicing in the teacher training program anyway. But what was a plus for them was that they were talking about something they knew about, that they felt passionately about, and that they loved to talk about. And so we had different things around the university. This was in the foyer of the library, where students were coming and going, and they took an interest in people. The teachers were there on hand for anyone who wanted to stop by and find out a little bit more. So when we represent people, we need to be aware of what we represent, who we're representing, and how we're representing those people. Are we going along with the stereotypes that exist, or are we looking at it differently so we're representing them more fairly? In activities and exercises that you may create as practice for your students, use names other than Peter and Jane and John and Jimmy. Yeah, use names from some of your class. By using their names within exercise activities, you'll notice a difference, because growing up in the UK, I never saw my name in an activity, in an exercise, or a children's book at all, until very recently, actually. And the feeling I got when I did see my name in a children's book was like, oh, that's my name. It was spelled differently, but it was still my name. And it gives you a kind of connection that when you are studying something like English language, and if you never come across your name in text in such a kind of book, then when you do see your name in the context of English language teaching, it adds a little something. It motivates you. It sounds silly, but it's something very small that we can do that could make a difference. Remember that English is a lingua franca, and that just because we're doing English language in the classroom doesn't mean everything has to be about England or the UK. And invite that the inclusion of students by encouraging them to represent their own cultures. It's still using the language, so we're not moving away from what we should be doing in the classroom. Another simple thing I think we could do is learn names. When someone gets your name wrong, it's a bit disheartening. But okay, you're in, I don't know, a coffee shop and someone says, oh, your coffee's ready, and they mispronounce your name. Fine, not a big deal. But when you're with the teacher over a period of time and that teacher is continually getting your name wrong, it gives you a sense that you don't really matter. It's not that important for the teacher to get your name right. So do make an effort. One way you can do that is record students saying their own names. Yeah. So you can listen to how they say it, and then you could record yourself saying their name and just see, am I getting anywhere near how they want me to say it? So get the pronunciation right. It can really build bridges in terms of getting that rapport and making that connection with students, especially if you're online. Get students to maybe explain their names. If they come from a culture where names still have meanings and they come from words or more poetic origins, then get students to explain meanings of the names. You could do that for all age groups, actually. It's a nice project to work on with children where they may not know the meaning of their name and they actually go away and find out. Their research may not be in English because they may be talking to family or looking up things in their own language. But when they have to present it or do a poster or talk about it, that goes into English and having to explain it. So it's still language oriented. And ensure students respect each other's cultures. Things may seem really strange to one nationality about another, but I think English language teaching has a really special place because you can help unite people from different parts of the world. They may have come in with one misconception or preconception about a group of people from another part of the world. You know, for example, oh, that woman's wearing a hijab, that means she's really conservative and she's really traditional, and I don't like that. But actually, when they get to meet that person or interact with that person, they may realize, oh, actually, she's just a person like anyone else. And that's just her personal belief, and actually she's very nice and I get along fine with her. So those are really nice opportunities to ensure that students respect one another. Now, I think it was Neil who pointed out, that during the pandemic, things changed. Siobhan very kindly sent me this from UK First Executive Summary. And as you can see, in 2021, during the pandemic, Saudi Arabia was the most represented source of students for UK First schools. And I'm just reading from statistics here, 37,894 student weeks were booked from Saudi, growing from 5,200 weeks in the first quarterly to 13,874 in the last quarterly. So if you do have large groups from particular countries like Saudi Arabia, then it's a really good way of getting them to talk about their lifestyle, their country, their food, their culture, their religion, if they're happy to do so. to help them. We can help them use English to portray themselves positively. Because let's face it, there's a lot of Islamophobia in the world because of various things that have happened around the world. But just because one group of people have done something doesn't mean we can say everyone is the same. And so I think for countries like Saudi Arabia, it would be really useful for their students to be able to learn how to talk about themselves, not to get defensive, but how to maybe talk to someone who maybe has a very different view about their society to help them understand. So we're actually using language for tolerance, language for understanding in the ELT classroom. And I don't think there's anything better that we could be doing personally. And I'd like to share with you this. This is a letter that was sent to my father. And as you can see, it was in 1969. And this was a letter of rejection because the applicant had to be of European race and colour. He still kept this letter. So you can imagine what it felt like receiving this letter. Now, 1969 is not that long ago, if you think about it. It's definitely within my lifetime. So we can say that, yes, possibly, that racism, that we have a responsibility to prepare students for the real world. Because, okay, that was 1969. But things have moved on. Yes, I'm very glad to say that they have. But back in 1989, when I was in my early 20s, I went into a shop in Leicester with a woman whose daughter had just gone to the country of Chad on an exchange. And I went shopping with the mother of this daughter, and the shopkeeper assumed that I was from Chad because her daughter had gone to Chad. Now, this was in Leicester in 1989. A few years later, Leicester was voted as the most multicultural city in Europe. So things happen. Therefore, preparing our students for racism isn't such a bad thing, I think. And race is a human construct because different races of humans don't exist, but race inequality and racism do exist. So I think it's within our remit to prepare our students for that. So I would like to just say thank you to English UK and Macmillan Education for inviting me to do this talk. But I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Please go ahead, either use the chat box. I think that would be easier if there are any questions.
Yeah, please do. Has anyone got any questions for Zarina?
If I may.
Neil, yes.
Nice
Zarina,
to see you, Neil.
Thank you so much. I mean, that was wonderful. Do you think that we have some signs of positivity? I mean, I'm involved in a number of international teacher development programs. The British Council, which I work for, has included EDI training as a mandatory core element of some of its future English programs. I'm also involved in judging something which I'm not allowed to talk about, but I can see in innovation a lot of moving away from nativism and embracing of English as a lingua franca. I'm not sure if these are just pockets of good practice or whether in fact we are now on the way. And I'd just be really interested to hear your views on whether the battle is being won. We certainly can't be complacent, but are we in a good place or a better place?
Oh, definitely in a better place. I mean, the fact that we're talking about these things is positive. 5 years ago, nobody would have invited me to talk on this topic. It was just seen as a little bit too political and a bit too sensitive. So I am seeing huge amounts of conversations, conferences, presentations on the topic, which is surely positive. And yes, I think we're beginning just the battle, really, in terms of how we are focusing on things in English language teaching. I think we're far from winning it. We've got a long way to go, but definitely we're on the right track. And anything and every conversation that can take place, in my mind, is a positive thing.
We therefore recognise the work of Siobhan herself and the anti-racism action group that she's set up within English UK as being part of that. And Siobhan, thank you for that. Thank you for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you so much, Neil. And yes, thank you, Siobhan. I've been really impressed in terms of how anti-racism is just so up there within the policy, and it's written down, which is fantastic.
Thank you. And it's a team effort. I can't take all the credit by any means, not at all. Jodie Gray, who many of you know, our chief executive, and also Eleanor Thomas, my colleague, are very also much at the forefront of sort of leading that anti-racism action group. And we encourage, if there's anybody here who's on the session and is interested in joining that group, please do get in touch. The group has no limits to the numbers. We're happy to have it as big as it needs to be. So if you're interested in being involved and sort of joining us, it's the start of a journey. But if you're interested in joining us as we sort of try to implement more anti-racist sort of activities and sort of encourage our members to really consider how they can be anti-racist as we sort of go forwards, please do get in touch. We'd love to have you involved. The anti-racism policy is on our website. Perhaps my colleague Roz, if you've got a minute to quickly dig out the link to that and pop it in the chat for anyone that would like to have a look at that. And what I'll do in the meantime is just thank you, Zarina. Really appreciate your time. It was very insightful, it was very thought-provoking and also very practical. So I hope that all the teachers on the call have gone away with some ideas about how they can sort of have those conversations with their students in the classroom. Thanks for your time and your preparation. And thanks for the audience. Thanks to the audience for taking part as well, for getting involved and using the chat box to interact with everybody. So we are going to call it a day